Hey, I am Lindsay Vallandingham with the Symphony Group right here in Louisville, Kentucky. We've been working on a 3-part series about how to buy a home. And today we're going to talk about part 3, the closing process. The reason I wanted to bring special attention to this single day component of the closing process is because I think for all of us, this is the part that we hear about the most. We hear it colloquially, right, in our communities. Oh, we're going to close on our house today. You hear it in movies. What does closing really even mean? What does that process look like? What can I expect? I just want you to understand what the process looks like a little bit so that you can be prepared for your own closing day. If you want to hear the other 2 portions of this content and all the other content that we produce, make sure that you subscribe to our channel so that you're getting up-to-date information. In the final days or sometimes hours before closing, we, the real estate agents, the buyer and the seller, will receive the closing settlement statement. Now you, the buyer, will have received your closing disclosure from your lender. That closing disclosure is going to outline all of your costs associated with the purchase, your monthly payment, and the amount of the check that you are to bring to closing. So it's going to have a final amount on it, and that document is called a closing disclosure. The settlement statement is going to come from the title company. When that settlement statement is issued to the real estate agents, both agents will review it for accuracy, make sure that it matches the contract that we have all been under for the duration. If they approve all of the numbers that are on there and say, yes, this looks like this is correct, then we will issue that settlement statement to the buyer and seller so that they can see it as well. That settlement statement for you, the buyer, should exactly match the closing disclosure that you've received from your lender. So the numbers are identical, they're just laid out in a different form. On the day of closing, you will need to obtain your closing funds. The closing disclosure and the settlement statement both are going to have a number at the bottom that's going to say funds needed to close for the buyer. That funds needed to close is comprising your down payment, closing costs, prorated taxes, anything that you need to bring to the table. In the state of Kentucky, you can either do that through a certified check or through an automatic bank wire transfer. Those are the only 2 things you can do in Kentucky. So you either need to go to your bank in person and pay for a certified check. So those are certified funds. They actually remove them from your account right there on the spot and give them over to you. Or you can initiate a wire transfer from your banking institution to the title office that's handling the closing. Those wiring instructions are important to obtain in person or over the phone. You never want to obtain wire instructions through email because there are just a lot of scams out there, and I'm looking to protect you and make sure that your money is protected as well, right? So make sure that you call or go into that title office to get those wiring instructions, okay? So in Indiana, your only option, if you have to bring more than $10,000 to closing, is to do that wire transfer. So make sure that during the process, you're connecting with your banking institution ahead of time to really understand what their policies are about initiating a wire transfer. Some banking institutions are going to require that you be there in person to initiate that transfer. Some banking institutions have other guidelines about how they process your wire transfer. So make sure you give them a call at least a few days in advance of closing, even if you don't know the exact amount yet, just to learn what their guidelines are for initiating that wire transfer so that you don't end up having to delay your closing. In Indiana, if your cash to close is under $10,000, then you can also bring a certified check from your bank for closing. Now, the title company is typically where we will all go to attend our closing. The title company has been working in the background while the lender is working through the loan. The title company is working on the title. The title company typically comprises several different attorneys that specialize in real estate practice, as well as an office staff, paralegals, and folks who help the attorneys get all of the components together to be able to close on the property. Now, closing can take place in any number of different places. We've held closings in our real estate offices. We've held closings in banks. So they can occur in many different places. You want to make sure that you know from your buyer's agent where your closing is going to take place. But 9 times out of 10, that's going to take place at the title attorney's office, and more than likely with one of their attorney representatives hosting the closing. At closing, in Kentucky and Indiana, typically the buyers and the sellers will attend closing together. That's not always the case. Sometimes schedules won't allow, sometimes folks are not in town. But 9 times out of 10, the buyers and the sellers, their respective real estate agents and maybe some extended family or friends might attend the closing. The closing room is relatively small, maybe seating 6 to 8 people on average. So keep that in mind if you need to bring a family member, if you need to bring children. The rooms are relatively small. The attorney will sit at the end of the table and the signing parties will sit next to that attorney. Sellers will sit on one side of the table, buyers will sit on the other side of the table. Real estate agents typically sit at the end of the table and are there for questions, to confirm documents, anything else like that. But typically real estate agents don't do much signing in the closing itself. That's mostly for the buyer and seller to take care of. Now the seller side doesn't have nearly as much to sign in a closing as the buyer side does because the buyer is signing their loan documents. And the loan documents are extensive when you're purchasing a home. So get your fingers worked out. Make sure you bring a pen you really like. If not, they'll give you one. But you're going to be signing a lot of paperwork. The attorney will talk you through all of the documents. If there's a document that you don't understand, that is an excellent time for you to pause the attorney and say, I don't understand. Could you please explain this further? They are happy to do that. They do a lot of closings in a day and they sort of get into a rhythm about it. So if there's something you don't understand, by all means, raise your hand or pause them for a second and say, excuse me, can you go back and explain that to me? Because this is an important document that you're signing. Obviously, it's related to the purchase of your home. There are so many documents with so much fine print that it isn't realistic, that you would have the time to sit there and read every single word. So you are going to be relying on that attorney to tell you what that document says and what exactly that you're signing. At closing, you will need a copy of your photo identification for all signing parties. Some places require 2 forms of photo ID. So bring your driver's license if you have that, passport if you have that. It's rare that we see that second form required in Kentucky and Indiana. Just ask your realtor if you're questioning whether that's something you need to bring. The signing process for all of the documents, depending on how big the package is that comes from the lender, can take anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. Some of that depends on how talkative the room is too, right? It's generally an excited atmosphere at closing. The sellers are happy to make some money that day. The buyers are excited about their new home. And sometimes that can just lead to a lot of chatter that sometimes makes the closing last a little longer, but always in good fun. The closing itself, I would plan to spend about an hour at closing and hope that maybe it takes a little less time. For the most part, our buyers receive their keys to their new home at the closing table. Sometimes they're literally passed across the table from the seller. Here's all my keys. Here's my garage door openers. This one goes to the front door. This one goes to the back door. All of that kind of information is communicated and passed along to the buyer at the closing table. In some cases, we have negotiated in advance of closing that the seller is going to retain possession of the property for some number of days after closing. And that's actually pretty common, especially if the seller is still living in the home at the time of the purchase. And we would arrange at closing for the time when those keys are going to be traded off. So say, for example, that the seller has possession of the property until 6:00 p.m. 3 days after the closing per our contract. So in that case, at the closing table, we would come up with a scheme for how we were going to get those keys from the seller to the buyer at that 6 p.m. time on the 3rd day after closing. A lot of times that's leave them in the house, we'll give you a garage code, or we'll all plan to meet at the house at the same time. There are plenty of solutions, but just know that we will work those out with the seller right there on the spot so that everybody's on the same page. What if you can't attend closing? Well, this happens from time to time for multiple reasons. Maybe you're a buyer moving into this area and you still are in a city far away and you can't be here for closing. If you have health issues, or if you are homebound for any reason, if you have an emergency or a family event that is going to keep you from attending closing, there are a few options that we can do to help you with that scenario. And I've done all of them. You can do what's called a mail away closing. If you know that you're not going to make it to closing well in advance, and you know exactly where you're going to be at the closing time, we can arrange for the title office to send the closing package to a title office in your area. You would simply go to that title office, you would sign everything with that attorney present or that notary present, return everything via an overnight mail service, back to Louisville, back to Southern Indiana, to the title office that issued those documents. The seller would sign them here, and that's how we would close. Sometimes we require what's called a mobile notary. If you're in the area, but say you're in the hospital, you've had an accident or you've had a sudden surgery, or maybe you're giving birth, had that happen, you need a notary who can come in and help you sign the closing documents while you cannot physically make it to the title office. So we have those types of options as well. Finally, we also have the option to do what's called a power of attorney. Now, there are power of attorney documents for everything under the sun. You can give someone your power of attorney for almost anything these days. But this power of attorney would be explicitly related to this real estate transaction and would only be good for signing the documents related to your real estate transaction. I would recommend identifying somebody that you really love and trust to be your power of attorney and sign in your stead if you cannot be there. This works really well in scenarios maybe with a married couple where one spouse can't attend closing, so the second spouse can sign on behalf of both of them. Sometimes that could be an adult child, a parent, another relative who's close by who is able to sign on your behalf. When all of the documents are signed, the attorney will take all of the paperwork that everyone has just completed and everyone's photo IDs. They'll make copies of everything, copies for themselves and copies for both parties in the transaction. They will come back to the room with a folder of the documents that you have signed. In some cases, you can opt into a PDF or a computerized version if you don't want to take all that paper home. But either way, you will receive copies of everything that you signed. Now, the most important thing that you're signing in that closing, of course, is the deed to your new home. The deed is recorded on the county records, and a copy of that is mailed back to the title attorney. As soon as the title attorney receives it, he will forward that document to you, the buyer. So you will have the original deed to your property. Now, in the days that follow closing, you will receive plenty of pieces of mail offering you an opportunity to purchase a copy of your deed. You don't need to do that. That original deed is going to come back to you, the owner of that home, via your title attorney as soon as they receive it. And that process can take, 3, 4, 5 weeks. So don't be looking for it right away. And if you don't receive it after a number of weeks, contact your real estate agent or the title office where you closed and just check in on that copy so that you have that. At the end of closing, you've got a folder of all of your documents. You might shake hands with the seller, might shake hands with the closing attorney. At the end of the day, you just bought your brand new home and you've made it through this incredible process. And we at the Symphony Group are so excited for our clients when they finally get those keys at the closing table. It's the best feeling for everyone. And sometimes you've got to go straight and move, and sometimes you've got to get right back to work. Whatever your circumstances are, I hope that they are joyful and that you enjoy your new home. And I really hope that this series of videos about the process has been eye-opening for you, educational for you, and more than anything, I hope it calms any anxious feelings that you might have about the buying process. Now, for a deep and personal buyer consultation to go into your specific needs and your personal criteria, please reach out to us at symphonyrealtygroup@gmail.com.